Well, you know, stories are chemistries. And sometimes when we put different chemistries together, they cause an unexpected reaction. So let's see what it is that happens for us when we mix two very different stories together. The first is that story set in a cave in the mountain of Tibet, and in that cave lived a demon. Now he was like a run-of-the-mill demon. He had horns sticking out of his head, he had sharp fangs coming out of his mouth, and he had these great long talons that came out. But you know, he was such a lonely demon, which is not surprising because he ate every damn thing that came by, which was not really conducive to making friends and having companionship. But he was very, very lonely. But, you know, from his cave, and we know that sound rises, in the valley below there was a monastery, and our demon could hear the sounds of the little drums that the monks tapped when they circumambulated the stupa in the monastery yard. And he could see the flickering lights of the candles as they walked around. He could hear the monastery bell when it rang to bring people to meditation. He could hear their chanting, their voices, the sounds that rose up, and it warmed his heart. He thought to himself, if maybe if he became a monk, then he would have what he longed for, this companionship and the warmth and the sharing. So he made a very big decision that he would come down the mountain and he would go and seek entry into the monastery. So when he came down, and of course he confronted the old abbot who was there, and he asked could he be admitted to come into the monastery and practice being a monk. Well, the old abbot, you know, pretended to be very stern about it, but secretly in himself he was thinking to himself what kudos it would be, what fame he would get from having a holy demon in his midst. But, you know, he said to the demon, well, yes, but, you know, we would have to confirm with the other monks and the senior beings before we could admit you. So it may take a little while. Perhaps you could give us a few days, but do you mind my saying so? In the meantime, those horns would get in the way of your conical hap. Do you think that you might be able to do something about those horns? So the demon went off, promising to come back down in a week, and when he got up the mountain, he got a sharp scraping off a tree, and he started to grind down his horns. Of course, it was a very, very painful process. But after the week, when he went down to see the abbot again, of course, he was hornless, and the abbot congratulated him on having no horns, but they had not come to a decision yet. It might take a few more days. But in the meantime, do you think you could do something about those fangs? Because, you know, they're going to get in the way of the cup that you drink your buttered tea out of. But come back in a week and I'll have a decision for you. So the demon went up to the mountainside again, and very painfully he got a couple of rocks and he pulled out his fangs. But oh dear, was his mouth sore. Anyway, the days passed and he came down and confronted the abbot again, and And the old abbot said, "Oh, yes, I can see. I can see you won't have any trouble now drinking your buttered tea. Yes, congratulations. But we haven't quite made a decision yet. Maybe just a few more days. And do you think in the meantime you could do something about those talons, because they're not going to allow you to grasp the holy books out of which we have our teachings?" So the demon went back, and with great pain he pulled out his talons. Oh dear, you can imagine the pain he was suffering. But anyway, the next time when he went down and faced the abbot said, yes, we've made a decision. You may be admitted to our monastery. But the poor demon was feeling so poorly now, he didn't care whether he was admitted or not. But anyway, he came down the mountain, he was admitted into the monastery gates, and he was put into a little cell where he was in such pain. His head was aching, and his teeth, where they were, his fangs were suppurating, and his talons doing the same. He could hardly drag himself to the meditation halls to do the rituals that were required of acolytes in that monastery. And it came to the stage where he was in such pain, and besides that he could not stomach the rice gruel that they fed up for their meals, just unpalatable to him. So it was no effort for him when he was finally confined to his cell. He could hardly get up off his pallet. Everything was aching. His head, where his horns had been, his mouth that was swollen, and his talons where they were. He could hardly touch anything, so he just lay there languishing. I don't know, after some days, a very strange thing began to happen. He began to feel a bit better. And he put his hands up to his head, and there were some little horns growing out. And then his teeth started to feel better, and he could feel his little fangs coming down again. And as for his talons, he could. So he started to sharpen them on the raffia mat that was on the floor of his cell, until after some days, one morning he woke up and he just felt terrific, except he was terribly hungry. So he opened the door of his cell, and a couple of monks walked by, so he just gobbled them up. And then when he was walking down the cloister, the old abbot came by, who was rather a rotund fellow, and so he just gobbled him up too. So he was feeling very, very good. So he literally danced up the mountain back to his cave. Now, whether he became a holy demon or not is really a very moot point, but one thing we know, he had no further aspirations, not for companionship, not to be holy or anything. He just went back to being a demon. And then the second story is about that man who started his life really as an ordinary man. He even had a stint in the emperor's army for a while, but then he had aspirations to become a monk, to find nirvana, to find peace, happiness, and all of those things that are said to go with that state. So he entered the orders and became a monk. And he became an exemplary monk. But it so happened that he also had talents. One of his talents was that he was a very good orator. He was able to express himself very, very well. So in learning the sutras and the tenets of his faith, there was a certain amount of preaching to be done out amongst the people in the towns, in the squares and so forth. So somehow his fame spread, and it came to the ears of the emperor himself, of this monk who was such a good orator. And so he was invited to the emperor's palace to become the personal monk, advisor, spiritual teacher of the emperor himself. And of course he lived in the lap of luxury. But one day, when he was standing out in front of a great throng of people about to give out of the teachings, suddenly his chest pumped up and he had an experience of a moment of pride. Look at me, all of these people basking in adulation. And then a very strange thing happened. Somehow out of the ethers, a speck, it seemed, came descending down, and he felt what was like an insect bite just in his groin. It was only a momentary thing, and after that he gave his oration to great fanfare. But after a couple of days, he found that this speck on his groin had grown into a lump which burst like a boil and then started to erupt in other places of his body until he was covered in these eruptions, suppurating as they did. He became smelly, objectionable to people around him. His robes clung to the pus that was coming out of these openings in his body. So he fell into disfavor. He was at last banished from the emperor's palace. He became a wanderer. He could not even go into inns because people could not stand his smell, and seeing him now covered in these pustules, he became a wretch. He wandered the roads till finally, one day, he came upon a lake. And the lake was like a mirror. And when he looked in the lake, instead of seeing his own visage, now even pockmarked with those terrible manifestations, he saw another face. A face that was strangely familiar to him. And then this image spoke to him. Ah, at last I've got you. While you were being so holy, I was not able to but in your moment of pride, I was able to again come to you. Don't you remember? I am that face that you met on the battlefield. And before you pierced me through with your sword, you obviously took pleasure in bringing about my demise. And now you have been punished. Now I have received my revenge and vengeance. Our monk fell on the side of the lake with tears streaming down his face as he placed his head in the grassy bank at the side of the lake. How would you complete this story? And what relationship, if any, does it have with the story of the demon? What is the chemical reaction of these two tales in us, forcing us to go deep, deep beyond our beliefs, deep beyond our conditioning, to our own experience, the intuition, the insights, the wisdom, the knowing that we find there. What's the chemical reaction of these two stories for you? Mix them together, just like when we bring chemistries together. Let them find their way. Deeper than beliefs, deeper than conditioning, drawing on our experiences and our knowing. What will they bring forth? What awareness arises? What happens when chemistries mix? Thank you.